Beller, the Beuren Beller, these are the arrested balls, the peasant balls, which were held to raise funds for the prisoners under the Tsar. And they sent large sums of money. These working people who would have to save pennies to contribute to the movement and to subscribe to their newspapers would send substantial sums of money to Tsarist Russia through the anarchist Red Cross. They founded an anarchist Red Cross in the years before the First World War. So I say it was a whole world. In the 1960s and 1970s, we heard a great deal about the libertarian counterculture, which was counterposed to the American culture of statism, of militarism. Well, this had already evolved in the 1880s, 90s, and in the decades before the First World War.
I'd like to welcome all of you to the 7th annual reunion of the Friends of the Ferrer Modern School. We've got a pretty good program set up for this afternoon.
This is a reunion of the Ferrer School. It's our 7th one, and about 100 to 200 of us come together every year, and there are very warm refreshments of our memories and of our friendships as we gather this way. No one has lost any interest in coming each year.
What was the Ferrer School? Was it an anarchist experiment or an educational experience? Or?
The Ferrer School was an anarchist experimental school, inspired by the work that Francisco Ferrer had been doing in Spain until he was martyred. And anarchists in America and in many countries organized such free schools where the children went to school and did not have to do anything that was set out by a teacher, but did the things they wanted to do.
School as it was run, and it was run differently often at different times throughout the years that it was in existence, but the period that I remember, there was a great attempt to keep apart politics and religion and everything else from the school. The school was run by the kids, more or less, with the adults. It was they had a common meeting, and we ran the school. You didn't have the kind of generation gap which we've seen in recent years, because there was nobody you were fighting against, in effect. The teachers were there, and they usually were called by their first name, and they were one of us all. You weren't forced to go to classes. You weren't forced to have marks or anything else. You could decide what you wanted to do, so that there was no, the authority came from not only yourself, but the whole student and school community.
The idea was that if children were removed from a regimented and demanding society which deformed them and put into a free ambiance, they would develop naturally, and they would naturally learn as long as there was any opportunity to learn. Of course, living was learning, and learning was something that children naturally did.
Now, for most people who've heard of the term anarchism, it's almost a synonym for terrorist. The anarchist is a wild-eyed, wild-haired person with a black cape, with a dagger in one hand, a bomb sputtering already in the other. Well, it is true that there was a terrorist element in the anarchist movement. A small minority, the vast majority of anarchists were very gentle and very idealistic people, and in fact frowned upon unmotivated terrorism and violence. The socialists would have nothing to do with this sort of thing, and they rejected terrorism altogether, whereas the anarchists tended at least to defend the terrorists even when they didn't agree with them. Incidentally, I don't want to go to the other extreme to deny that there were any terrorists among the anarchists. What I'm emphasizing is it was a small minority. That is, there were a handful of individuals who carried out terrorist acts, a small segment of the movement who supported them. A fairly large segment sympathized with these terrorists, whom they saw as avengers and deliverers, you see. People who were doing propaganda not by the word, as in the Freiheitliche Stimme, but by the deed, to inspire people to act and to make a revolution.
In alle Gassen, wo man geht, hört man Sabberstoff, Jinglach, Mädlach, Kind und Cage, wo sind Pumpribotjes?
Jinglach, Mädlach, Kind und Cage, wo sind Pumpribotjes? Genug schon wieder Horven, genug schon Borgenleien. Macht das Sabastofke, lo mir Brüder sich befreien. Macht das Sabastofke, lo mir Brüder sich befreien. Brüder und Schwester, lo mir den Körben die Hände. Lo mir Nikolai, Kellen zerbrechen die Wände. Hey, hey, da loi Polizei, da loi samene Jarwitz, Rassei. Hey, hey, da loi Polizei, da loi samene Jarwitz, Rassei. Brüder und Schwester, lo mir gehen zusammen. Lo mir Nikolai kennen, begraben mit der Manne. Hey, hey, da loi Polizei, da loi samene Jarwitz, Rassei.
Nächten hat geführt, hat weggelemist. Heute ist geworden, a Kapitalist.
Hey, hey, da loi Polizei, da loi samene Jarwitz, Rassei.
In 1919, when the Communist Party started in the United States, it was a terrible blow to the Yiddish anarchists and to the readers of the Freie Arbeiterstimme. What happened is this: just as in Soviet Russia, the communists used anarchist slogans. When, for instance, Lenin promulgated the slogan of the factory to the workers, the land to the peasants, all power to the Soviets, this is pure and simple anarchism. Remember, he never mentioned in all these three slogans not the state, not the dictatorship of the proletariat. Now, when the anarchists listened to these slogans, they were attracted to them. So here in the United States, just as as in Russia, anarchists worked with the Bolsheviks at the very beginning. But here, an interesting thing happened. Yanovsky, that clear-headed guy, said the Bolsheviks will never introduce these slogans, will never practice what they preach. This is just a lie. It's not true. They're not going to give all the power to the... They're not going to give all the power to the Soviets. They're not going to give the factories to the workers. They're not going to give the land to the peasants. Everything will belong to the state. And he was against joining the Bolsheviks, against joining the communists here, and many of the young anarchists, most of the young anarchists, the most active, broke away from the Yiddish anarchists, broke away from the Freie Arbeiterstimme and weakened it, and they formed the backbone of the Communist Party in the United States.
Ich bring euch a Gries in the trenches. Ich bring euch a Gries in the boys. Wir kämpfen mit Mut, mit Courage, mit Blut. Und wenn die Deutschen lachen, seh sich heus. Ich bring euch a Gries in the Samis. Das ist der Gries, du sollten sei. Weil wir seine Scheune reden müssen, wir die Schlacht gewinnen. Ist der Gries von Uncle Sam's Armee. Ich bring euch a Gries in the trenches. Ich bring euch a Gries in the boys. Sie kämpfen mit Mut, mit Courage, mit Blut. Und wenn die Deutschen lachen, seh sich heus. Ich bring euch a Gries in the Samis. Das ist der Gries, du sollten sei. Weil wir seine Scheune reden müssen, wir die Schlacht gewinnen. Ist der Gries von Uncle Sam's Armee.
With the war, a tremendous hysteria seized the country. The atmosphere was terrible. They hated the Germans, so in the city here, you couldn't say, I want a pound of a can of sauerkraut. You didn't buy sauerkraut. You bought Liberty cabbage. The mayor, a bastard if ever there was one, he said, all signs must not use red paint because we don't want them reds around. You wouldn't even have the color. No red was to be in any of the colors or flags or anything in the school or anything else. Mobs and mobs of people chased the anarchists. The Attorney General was a man named Palmer. And the raids were made against all radical halls and homes of individuals. And they'd get into a place and they'd wreck the office, they'd break the machines, they would arrest people on no charges at all, let them out, then arrest them again.
Actually, the Palmer raids were the tail end of this. It all begins during the war itself, where the anarchists were, for the most part, what they called internationalists. They refused to take sides in the war. They were against war. They considered it to be a capitalist struggle where the working man was used as cannon fodder for the purposes of imperialism and the spread of their own local interests, business interests. And the anarchists, of course, refused to fight. Many of them were pacifists by conviction. Others would not take up arms for any government. Not only did they refuse to fight, they agitated against conscription. When conscription was introduced in this country, America entered the war in April of 1917. Alexander Berkman and Emma Goldman and many of the people associated with the Feierabend Stimme conducted rallies and made speeches trying to discourage people from registering for the draft. And eventually they were prosecuted. There were several laws that passed during the First World War. Espionage Act was one of them, for example, under which many anarchists and wobblies and militant socialists were tried and eventually convicted, sent to prison, and then ultimately deported. In one boatload alone on the Buford in December of 1919, the cargo contained 250 anarchists who were being shipped back to Russia, including Emma Goldman and Alexander Berkman.
Well, let's be honest about it. Most of our friends got underground. In other words, the thing became so that everybody was being arrested, and people, if they could possibly lay low, they laid low. No question about it. Laid low. Everybody, in fact, I was arrested during the war at the picnic of the Workers' Institute. That time I made an anti-war speech. I was arrested and thrown into jail. I was in jail from Sunday until Thursday. I was taken for the commissioner Thursday, and the commissioner happened to be a man named Schlottfield, a German, who I think his sympathies may have been a little bit the other way. I was taken to the commissioner. He said to me, "That was a picnic? You were drinking? You had a lot of liquor in you?" So I said, "I was drunk." He said, "You wouldn't say it if you're sober, would you?" Discharged. Otherwise, I'd been in jail for years.
When the raids were over, they began to look for individuals. And apparently they had my name on the list. But I understood that they were coming to look for people there, that they're not just going to let me go for nothing. So I didn't go home. But they went to my house, and they came into the room. I had a room with people there. When they came in, the people let them in, so they looked over the literature, and they saw my books were all on anarchism. And they were looking for something to get to recognize me. But after they didn't find anything there. They looked at the wall, they saw a painting hanging. So they asked the people whose painting it is, so they said, "That's mine." And they took all that painting and they hung it up in the police station. And 20 years later, I came in with Nelson. We were arrested and brought into that precinct. And Nelson says to me, "Give a kick." And I looked up and there was my painting hanging. 20 years after that.
You know, there was a guy named Moses.
Oh, yeah.
Well, he had a brother. And that brother's name was the name that I'm telling you.
Aaron?
That's right.
Aaron.
Yeah, I had it in Yiddish, you see. That's the way it's spelled in Hebrew.
Selma and I did not marry until a few years ago.
Why didn't you marry?
I guess because we are anarchists, and we didn't regard a marriage by either by a clerical group or by the state as necessary for our marriage, for our living together. However, as we reached the age of retirement and Social Security, I had heard the stories of other anarchists